Hey y'all, in this video we're going to get into moving and placing vectors, sizing and resizing vectors. Now, even though I am using VCarve Pro version 12.013, this works identically in all of the Vectric software titles, be it Cut2D, VCarve, or Aspire. In previous videos, I did demonstrate the move and transform mode. Let me go ahead and draw a rectangle vector. I'll just draw it out here. The size doesn't really matter. We'll close it. Now, I demonstrated the move and transform mode, which is click once to select the vector, then click a second time to put it into move and transform mode. And this was where we were able to grab the vector and move it based on one of the sides of, in this case, the rectangle, or we can grab the square in the center and place it as well. We could also resize or scale the vector, or we could rotate the vector. But when it comes to placing a vector in a specific location, that can be done over here under Transform Objects. So let's go ahead and select our vector that we want to move to a specific location. And we'll come over here under Transform Objects to the first icon, which is Move Selected Objects. Now we can click on that, and that puts our rectangle into Move and Transform mode. Now we have several decisions to make here. First, we need an anchor point. What are we going to base this move on? Currently, it's set to the center. So any change I make down here is going to move the center to this location. Now, I don't have to use the center. I could use any one of the four corners. But the important thing to remember is that this anchor point is what is going to be moved to a location that we select down here. From there, we have two different types of moves we can make. We can make an absolute move, or we can make a relative move. An absolute move means we're moving our anchor point to an absolute coordinate location. Now, in this example, I have my X and Y zeros in the center of my material. So an absolute move, I could enter 1 X and 1 Y. And then the minute I hit apply, because I have my anchor point being the center, it's going to move the center to X1, Y1. I'll go ahead and click apply, and you can see that it's moved the center of this. If we look at my readouts down here, when I put my cursor over the center, we're at X1, Y1. That is an absolute move. It uses absolute coordinates out here on the workpiece. A relative move is a movement relative to its current position. So if I decided I wanted the center of this rectangle moved up an inch and moved to the right an inch, what I would want to do is move my X position 1 inch over to the right by using a positive number, and 1 inch up in Y using a positive number. It is a move relative to its current position. I'll click apply, and that moves the center point of that rectangle 1 inch up and 1 inch to the right of its previous position. If I decide I need it over here, let's say I want it an inch to the right of my 0, but I want the Y position to stay the same. I now know that this, by looking at my readouts again down here, I know that this center point is 2 inches over from 0 in X and 2 inches up from 0 in Y. If I want this center point 1 inch this way, I need to move it 3 inches. 2 inches would take me back to 0 point, and another inch would bring me over here. But it needs to be a negative move. So, in X, I would say negative 3.0. I don't want a Y position change, so I'll leave that at 0. Again, this is a relative move, and I'll click Apply. Again, that's relative to its former location. If I want an absolute move, I want to put this corner on my X0, Y0. I'll select that corner, and I'll enter X0, Y0. Click Apply, and that corner is now on my X0, Y0. Using Move Selection is a way of moving your vector, be it an open vector or a closed vector. It's a way of moving that vector to an exact position based on the center or one of the 4 corners. Now let's close this. I say the 4 corners. What happens if we're using a circle? There are no corners on a circle. This is where we get into something that is known as a bounding box. And you're going to hear the phrase bounding box with several of the tools. A bounding box is an imaginary box that surrounds your vector. Let me try to demonstrate it using guidelines, okay? I have my circle here. There are no corners on a circle. But if I use a guideline and I drag it down here, and I take another guideline and drag it here. Now I'm going to take a vertical guideline and drag it to this corner, or this edge rather, and another one over here. Where these guidelines intersect is an imaginary box around this circle. A bounding box is this imaginary box. So, to demonstrate that, I can show you that if I go into Move Selected Objects, I select my circle, then turn off the guides. If I want an absolute move, I want to put this corner of that imaginary box on my X0, Y0. I'll select that corner, and again, this is not a corner of a circle. The circle doesn't have any corners. It's that imaginary bounding box. I'll make sure it's an absolute move, and I'll go X0, Y0, and I'll click Apply. Now let's zoom in here, and you can see that this edge of the circle is on my X0 line. And this edge of my circle is on my Y0 line. The imaginary box around this circle, the corner, is right here. If I take another guideline, let me get out of my Move tool, draw another guideline right here, and bring another guideline down here, we can see that the intersection of that bounding box is right here on my X0, Y0. So that's how the Move Selected Objects tool works with circles or ovals. It takes that imaginary bounding box and moves the bounding box to that location. Let me turn off my guides here so we don't get confused. With this selected, I'll go back into Move. If I'm moving the center of my circle, then there is no bounding box to consider. I can move this to X0, Y0, and it'll place the center of my circle on my X0, Y0. If I want that center of my circle moved relative to its current position, I want it to be 2 inches over to the positive in X and 3 inches down in the negative 3.0 in Y. Again, it's moving the center of the circle relative to its current position. I'll click Apply, and it moves the center of my circle. Again, look at my readouts down in this corner. I'm now at +2 in X, -3 in Y. So what if I have multiple items? Well, it works in a similar fashion. Let me come back up and I'll draw some circles here. They don't even have to be the same size. I have 3 separate circles right here. I can select all 3 of them and come into Move Selection. I can move all of them relative to their current positions. They will all move. Again, using that bounding box. I'll close this. I'll drag a guideline to the farthest left edge of the vector that is furthest to the left of my X0, Y0. Then I'll draw another guideline all the way to the right, the vector that is furthest to the right. Then I'll draw a guideline down to the bottom, and then another guideline down to the top, so that I have all of these vectors surrounded by guides. You don't need to do this. This is just a way for me to show you what that bounding box looks like. So now, with all 3 of my vectors selected, if I go into Move Objects, whether I'm making a relative move or an absolute move, we can now get a better idea of where these are going to be moved to. If I make a relative move, 1 inch positive in X and 1 inch negative in Y, it's going to move the center to the right 1 inch and down 1 inch. And I'll click Apply, and that you can see that that entire bounding box has moved. Now if I Control Z to undo that, if I make it an absolute move, I can use the center of our bounding box, or I could use any of the corners. So if I want to move this corner of our bounding box to my X0, Y0, I can do that. Now it's not going to move my guidelines, so I'll turn my guidelines off. But I'll select the bottom left corner, 0 in X, 0 in Y. I'll click Apply, and now the bottom left corner of that bounding box is on my X0, Y0. So, To sum up, move selection is a way to move your vectors individually or together, to move them to a precise location, whether that be an absolute coordinate out here on the workpiece or relative to their current positions. The next tool we're going to discuss is the second icon under Transform Objects, and that is Set Selected Objects Size. I use this a lot for resizing or rescaling, but I also use it to check on the size of an object. If I'm not sure how big an object actually is, I can select that object, come over here, and I can see that it's 2.2 inches wide in X and 2.2 inches high in Y, which makes sense because it's a perfect circle. That's a quick and easy way to figure out what size an object is. Now, when we get into rescaling or resizing objects, we have a few choices to make. We can scale the selection. Now, right now, I only have one vector selected, so that's what we'll use. Just like the Move Objects tool, we need to pick our anchor point. Are we resizing from the center? Are we resizing from one corner of our bounding box? In this case, I'm going to use the center, which means if I rescale this, if I resize it, it's going to expand from the center out. It's going to enlarge or reduce in size from the center. If I choose one of these corners, that corner of the bounding box is going to stay put and the others will move. And I'll show you what I mean in just a minute. Now down here we have our width in X and our height in Y. Over here we also have link XY. What this does is, with this check mark here, any new size I enter in width in X is going to change the height in Y to keep this in the current proportions. If I want to keep this a circle, I'll keep link XY checked. If I want to turn it into an oval, I will uncheck link XY. Then I can create a new width in X and a new height in Y right here. For right now, though, I'm just going to demonstrate the easiest resizing, which is I want to make this 2 inches in diameter rather than 2.2. So I'll just select either one because I have link XY checked. I'll say 2.0. Then I'll click Apply. And my circle is now 2 inches in diameter. Now, if I select the bottom right corner of my bounding box, and I want to make this 2.5 inches in diameter, but leave this positioned where it's at, make it grow in this direction, I'll select my width in X and say 2.5, then click Apply, and this corner stayed put. The size increase took place, but this position right here did not change. And I can do that with any of the corners of my bounding box. Now, I mentioned link XY and how if this is checked, if I enter one size here, it's going to make a change down here as well because it wants to maintain the proportions. If I unlink the X and Y, I can now change the width of this circle without changing the height. So if I come in and just change this to 2.75, for example, but I don't change my height in Y, and I'm moving from this bottom corner, click Apply, and now I have a slight oval. This edge did not move. It grew in this direction, and the height did not change. If I click on the center, and I make this 3.5, click Apply, it's grown in this direction from the center, but my height in Y remains the same. Then I can close that and carry on with my design. In a case where I have multiple vectors out here, I can scale them in two different ways. I'll go into Set Selected Object Size after I have selected all of my vectors, and now I have a couple of choices. I can scale the entire selection, which means the entire selection will get bigger based on the bounding box that surrounds all of these vectors. Or I can scale them individually, which means the diameter, in this case, of each individual circle will change. This comes in extremely handy. If I've got all these circles out here, and as you can see, they are 1/4 inch in diameter. If I discover they should be 1/2 inch in diameter, I can scale the items individually from the center. I want to make sure I link my X and Y to keep their proportion. And I can go to either width in X or height in Y, and I can change that to 0.5, and we see my height in Y changed automatically as well. Then I can click Apply, and each one of those circles is now 1/2 inch in diameter. Now let me Control Z and undo that. If I scale the selection, you notice my size. That is the size of the bounding box that holds all of these circles. I also have Link XY checked, so anything I change, let's say I change this to 7 inches, this has also changed. It's going to change the size of the entire selection. So I'll click Apply, and we saw how it grew just slightly. Close, and I'll click off for a second. Also, each of these 1/4 inch circles are just slightly larger than 1/4 inch. I not only increase the size of each circle, I increase the size of that bounding box surrounding those circles, so they're now spread a little bit further apart. This does come in handy on occasion, but more often than not, I will Control Z to undo that. More often than not, this is used to scale items individually. Not always, but more often than not, they are. So, this is how you would use Move Selected Objects to place these objects exactly where you wanted them, somewhere within the material workpiece, be it an absolute move or a relative move. This is also how you would scale objects either individually or in a group. Now, I know there's no way I answered every question you may have about moving or scaling objects. So this afternoon at noon Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern, I'll be hosting a live Q&A session where you can ask me anything you'd like about anything I've demonstrated in this video or any of my previous videos. Again, that's today at noon Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern, right here on my YouTube channel, and I put a link to that live Q&A down in the description box of this video. Before we wrap this up, I'd like to say a special thank you and give a special shout out to my channel members. Thank you, channel members. I appreciate your continued support. If you would like information on how to become a channel member, just click that little join button down below this video panel. Another panel will pop up and a video will play that'll tell you all about channel membership. We have a great group of people and we'd love to have you join us. So, I hope to see you all later on this afternoon for the live Q&A session. And as always, whether you subscribe to my channel or not, whether you become a channel member or not, I'd like to thank you very much for taking the time to watch, and y'all take care.